Okay, we continue Gemoro and Yoma. Ein Ches Amud Aleph, 78a. And we are towards the bottom of the page. The exact line is Amar Rabbi Menashe ben Bar Tachlifa. It's roughly 10 lines from the bottom of the page. As the line starts, the words Amar Rabbi Menashe bar Tachlifa. The Gemara is going to tell us a story, and the entire story is interesting in and of itself, and has halachic teaching also in and of itself, but it's really only brought as an introduction to the story that will follow, in which it's going to discuss the laws of Yom Kippur. So the first story goes like this. Amar Rav Menashe bar Tachlifa. Rav Menashe, the son of Tachlifa, says, Amar Rav Amram, in the name of Rav Amram, Amar Rabba bar Bachana, in the name of Rabba bar Bachana. Sha'alu. They asked, scholars asked, as Rabbi Elazar, who as Rashi tells us is Rabbi Elazar ben Padas, one of the earlier Tannaic scholars in the Mishnaic era. So they asked him, Zaken, if an older person, yeshiva, and he's sitting, you can translate this literally as the yeshiva, but Rashi adds he's sitting in the Sanhedrin. So he's on the high court, he's an elder, he's a venerable man, he's a scholar, studies Torah, he's consulted in halachic matters. So they're asking the question, is he required to ask permission to permit a firstborn animal or not? What's this referring to? The halach with the firstborn animal is as follows. It's one of the gifts the kohen one is required to give to the kohen, is the firstborn animal. The halacha is in temple times, if the animal has no blemish, it's then offered in the temple, and the kohen consumes most of it, if not all. Certainly most of it. All of it, even, yeah. And then, if, however, contracts a blemish, then you're not required to take it to the temple. The kohen eats it as if it were unholy, ordinary food. If it's unblemished, it becomes a holy, sanctified item, and all the laws regarding eating sanctity are attached to that because it's offered in the temple. If it's found to have a blemish, then the kohen eats it just like it was ordinary gift. No. Sorry? If it has a blemish, it's automatically redeemed. Yes, that's correct. But there's no. No. There are other gifts that are like that, not this one. Yeah. Other gifts of the kohen also sometimes redeemed, like certain types of maasros. It can be redeemed when you're taking, especially if you're taking them to Jerusalem. You can change it for money, all kinds of different things like that. But this is doesn't look like that. So the Gemara asks, Michael Maboyalo, what are they asking their Elazar? So if an older person is a venerable person, he's asking, is he allowed to permit a bechar, which means you have to examine the animal, find a blemish, which in and of itself takes a certain level of skill and knowledge. And if you find a blemish, you could say, okay, kohen, you're allowed to enjoy it. Whatever you want. Now, when it comes to post-temple eras, this is even more important. Because in post-temple eras, you cannot bring it as an offering. So a person who has a firstborn gives it to a kohen, and if the animal is unblemished, it becomes the kohen's problem now to feed it and take care of it until it actually contracts a blemish, and then he can eat it, because there is no temple to offer it. So the kohen actually had a vested interest in that, hoping you would have contract a blemish. Otherwise, it's a burden. If it has a blemish, now you can eat it. That's going to come up important in a moment. But for now, yeah. I'm not sure. I'm not going to answer the question. I don't know. Offhand, I don't know. It's a good question. At any rate, so at the moment they're asking Elazar, if an older person is a venerable person, he's well respected, and he's sitting in the Sanhedrin, as Rashi says it, is he allowed to examine a bechar and determine whether it has a blemish or not to permit the kohen to eat it? Or does he have to take permission, ask permission of the Nasi, of the leader of the Jewish people, as you described yesterday? Does he have to ask permission? So what's this question? Every time a halacha question is asked, every rabbi has to ask permission from the Nasi? The Gemara explains. This is the premise of the question. in line with that which Idi son of Abin said. Who the davar zeh, this idea, this thing of permitting this specific law, permitting the bechor of examining it and determining whether it has a blemish to allow it to be eaten by the kohen, he nichul lam lebein asiyah, was left as the prerogative of the house of the princes. And this is a way to give them certain privilege. In other words, they needed to, in order to bolster the authority of the nasi, of the prince, who again, as I mentioned before, is a Torah leader, but also a political leader. So as a way of giving them more respect and giving them more credit, they reserved certain halachic questions that only they can answer. And one of them is, or maybe the only one, I don't know if there are others, but certainly this one is the law regarding the Bukhar. And therefore, this older, venerable person, does he have to ask permission from the Nasi? May I answer the question? Or may I answer such questions in general? Or perhaps, given the Zakav Yeshiv Yeshiva, because he's such an elder, venerable person, and he's sitting in the Sanhedrin, he doesn't need to ask permission, because everybody knows he's a respectable person in town, or in the Jewish community in general. And there's no reason for him to ask permission, because him answering the question would not slight the prince. It would only slight the house of the prince if a random rabbi, as it were, answered these questions. But an elder person, maybe not. Or perhaps we make the rule is you have to have permission, and even an elder person has to ask permission. This is what they asked Rabbi Elazar ben Padas. Clear? So amongst the assembled was Rabbi Tzadok ben Chalukah, and Amar Rabbi Tzadok ben Chalukah al Raglav. Rabbi Tzadok son of Chalukah stood up on his legs. It's an expression to say that he asserted his opinion. And he said, Anira isi es Rabbi Yosi ben Zimra. I saw Yosi ben Zimra, Shezakin, who was an elder person. The Yoshe b'Yeshiva, and he sat on the council in Sanhedrin. He was. The Amad ben Maila, Mizikne Shozah, and he stood literally above the grandfather of this one. I think it means he's older, or he stood like in front of him, as Rashi says it. So he stood in front of the grandfather of this one. So whoever the current Nasi, current prince at the time of Rabbi Elazar ben Padas was, his grandfather was also the Nasi. Right, for many generations, the Nasi went father to son, starting from Hillel all the way down to Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, the prince who wrote the Mishnah, and then even his children, his son, and I think even his grandson, maybe even more. But it went for a good 8-9 generations. So Rabbi Tzadok says, yeah? Seniority. Yeah. But the Nasi had his own position outside of the seating ring of the Sanhedrin, because he's the Nasi, he was the prince. So Rabbi Tzadok says, I saw Rabbi Yosi ben Zimra, who was an older, venerable person, and he stood up in front of the grandfather of the current Nasi, and he first asked permission in order to permit firstborns by examining it and determining if it had a blemish. So this is supposed to prove that you indeed need to ask permission, because I saw Rabbi Yosi ben Zimra do so in front of the grandfather of the current Nasi, who was the Nasi at the time. Clear? Rabbi Abba. So Rabbi Abba was also present during this discussion in the presence of Rabbi Elazar ben Padas. And he tells Rabbi Tzadok, that was not the story. You got it wrong. So this was the story. Rabbi Yosi ben Zimra kohen hoyer. Rabbi Yosi ben Zimra was a kohen. He wasn't asking permission whether or not he's allowed to answer the halacha question of examining a blemish. He was asking what the halacha is with regard to a kohen himself examining a bechor, firstborn. As I mentioned before, post-temple times, the kohen had a vested interest in the animal getting a blemish, because otherwise he couldn't eat it. He was very biased. And Afshi therefore says that they were choshed, they were suspected of this, according to Gemoro elsewhere, that the kohenim were suspected of not just lying about finding blemishes, but actually making blemishes. Because it was a burden. You got this animal, you have to take care of it for months and years. So secretly, you make a little slice in a place and you show the rabbi, and that's it. And therefore, this was Rabbi Yosi's question. Rabbi Yosi ben Zimra asking the grandfather of the current Nasi. He wasn't asking whether he was allowed to answer the question. He was asking, he himself was a kohen. And this is what he was asking of the Nasi. Or this is what he was asking of the Nasi, the prince. Halacha Rav Meir. Do we follow Rav Meir? The Amar who said, Someone who's suspected of an item, loidonu, cannot judge on that question. And that cannot testify on such question, which would therefore bar the kohen from answering any questions related to discovering a blemish in a bechor, or perhaps halacha Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. The halacha follows Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, who was also a nasi, which said nemanu al shachaverdai. A kohen is allowed to answer a question regarding a blemish of a bechor with respect to the animal donated to another kohen. But he cannot answer the question regarding himself. And this is what Rabbi Elazar ben Zimra was asking. May I answer questions regarding myself? Or sorry, I for sure cannot answer a question regarding a gift someone gave me because I'm a kohen. But may I ask a question regarding a fellow kohen? Answer a question regarding a fellow kohen. He wasn't asking permission. He didn't need permission. He was just asking what the halacha is, what the law is. May he answer the question for a fellow kohen. And the nasi responded, halacha Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, the halacha follows Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, who again was a nasi himself. Meaning that he is allowed to answer the question with regard to a bechor of a friend. So this is all an introductory story to set the scene for the following story, which is, it's a very interesting story just to see how Torah discussions happened thousands of years ago. It's quite fascinating. And it's the most amazing part of it is that you can walk into yeshiva today and see the exact same thing happen. You literally can see the exact same thing happen. A bunch of yeshiva students ask a rabbi a question. Somebody else pops up and says, I was in a different yeshiva last year and I heard from this one answer this way. And somebody else says, no, you got it wrong. This literally could have happened today and any yeshiva and all over the world, which is an amazing thing. But this is all, again, the setup for the next story, which is, they further asked him, meaning Rabbi Elazar ben Pados. Rabbi Elazar ben Pados, who they asked the original question to about whether the elder person needs to ask permission from the nasi in order to answer the question of bechor, they ask him another question, which is, what's the law, lotzes besandal, to walk around wearing a sandal, shel sham, of a material called sham. This material, so let me just go to the next page. This material, I don't know what Rashi, I mean, see what Rashi says, but I don't know what it means. Min guma shekorin pavoy. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Maybe someone knows. A straw? I was hoping someone would know the translation in the French, because Steinsaltz translated it as cork. There's other ones that are coming up that are straw. But this is what Steinsaltz translated as cork. At any rate, guma is like guma means a kind of soft material. So, guma is the Hebrew word or Aramaic word. Yeah, it means like a soft material. That's what guma means. And how do you pronounce it? Pi? Gumi. No. There's Rashi puts a French word. Shekorin, pei vav yud. Pi. That's straw in French is pie. Interesting. Okay, Steinsaltz translated as cork. At any rate, it's not a leather shoe. So they asked him, are you allowed to wear the shoe of sham, let's just call it sham, on Yom Kippur? This is what they asked the Rabbi Elazar ben Pados. Yeah, exactly, something like that. Exactly, that's what I was thinking of. When I read Steinsaltz's translation, I was thinking of a kind of Bergenstock kind of shoe. We have a leather cork bottom. It's not comfortable. Okay, so they asked Rabbi Elazar ben Pados if this is allowed. Rabbi Yitzchak ben Nachmani, who's one of the other people present. So we know already a few people are present. We know Rabbi Abba was present. We know Rabbi Tzaddik is present. And now we know Rabbi Yitzchak ben Nachmani is present. So when you read these kind of stories, this is how historians place scholars at different places. Okay. So Rabbi Yitzchak ben Nachmani says, Anida isi is Rabbi Shimon ben Levi. I saw Rabbi Shimon ben Levi. Sheyatzav a sandal shal sham, that if he's wearing a sandal of the sham material, Yom Kippur. V'aminale, and because I saw him do this, which was interesting in and of itself, it taught me a halacha that you're allowed to wear this sham material on Kippur. So I asked him, what's the law with respect to a public fast? Not public fast that we observe, but this is a public fast instituted because there's lack of rain. We learned Tannaic here together, didn't we? Many years ago. Yeah. And there we learned that when we have a fast because of rain, because of this lack of rain, Now, one of the things you're not allowed to do is not allowed to wear a sandal, not allowed to wear shoes, just like Yom Kippur. So I asked him, this permissibility that I'm learning from you to wear these sham shoes, these cork shoes, let's just say, does the same thing apply to such public fast days that are instituted for the need of rain? And Amar Li, Rabbi Shimon Levi responded to me, Leishna, makes no difference. Both on a public fast day and on Yom Kippur, you may wear these cork shoes. And now we know another person who was in this crowd when they were asking Rabbi Elazar ben Padas. Interesting, they're all asking Rabbi Elazar ben Padas, but he's not the one to answer. I guess it teaches you something about being a good teacher, allowing the students to think of themselves. Anyway, interesting enough. So another scholar is at this conversation, and he's Rabbi Bar Chana. Rabbi son of Bar Chana says, Anira Isi, I saw Rabbi Elazar de Min Ninveh. I saw Rabbi Elazar who came from Ninveh. Sheyatsa b'sandal shasham b'tanis tzibur. I saw him wearing a sandal, a sandal of cork on Tanis Tzibur on a fast day. It wasn't Yom Kippur like Yitzchak Bar Nachmani saw Rabbi Shimon Levi. It was on a fast day that I saw that Rabba saw Elazar of Ninveh wearing a cork sandal. Now, and I asked him the question in reverse. Yom Kippur Mai, are you allowed to do this in Yom Kippur too? And Amar Li, he told me, Leishna, it makes no difference. Whether Yom Kippur, whether it's public fast day, you may wear these cork shoes. Now the Gemara comments on a few different scholars. I think it's unrelated to the story I mentioned before, unrelated to the conversation. I believe that's over. And now the Gemara just lists other scholars who wore other materials, other shoes made of other materials on Yom Kippur. And this is going to be, again, obviously the foundation upon which we're going to learn the Shulchan Aruch when we get there, which is, Rabbi Yehuda nafik b'dehitni. Rabbi Yehuda walked around on Yom Kippur with dehitni. It's another kind of sha'am. This translates as actual straw or reeds, I think. I don't know, whatever. It's another thing. What does he say dehitni? Let's see. Pull it up. Says, Rabbi Yehuda went around wearing reed sandals. Okay, Abaye nafik b'dehutzi. Abaye went with sandals made out of dehutzi, which, as Rashi says it's sandals made of fibers from a palm tree. You know, like the big thick strings inside. They're in between, that are under the skin, under the bark. Have you seen those? If you peel off the bark of a palm tree, there's a thick layer. It's quite a thick layer of like mushy fibers, mushy reeds type thing. So that's what it seems like. He used that to make his sandal. It's kind of comfortable. That's what Abaye did. And Rava nafik b'divli. Rava went around with b'divli, which Rashi says is grass. This is, I guess, reeds, just like a long, strong grass. I guess he twined it together and made it into a sandal. And then finally, Rabba bar Rav Huna, Rabba son of Rav Huna, Karoch Sudra Akare, would tie a cloth to his foot, the nafik, and that's what he would wear on Yom Kippur. So unless it qualifies as a bona fide halachic shoe, permissible to wear it on Yom Kippur. As we're going to see tomorrow in the next conversation, which is a little bit more nuanced, but there what's going to emerge is the issue of wearing a shoe on Yom Kippur is not for concern of comfort. And therefore, wear comfortable shoes. That's not the point. The point is not to wear bona fide halachic shoes, even if what you're wearing happens to be comfortable. That's what's going to emerge, God willing, from the discussion we're going to read tomorrow, which is going to come to prosthetic legs.
So it's like someone to Shabbat where you do something well that's permissible, but you have to do it in a way that's unlike doing it.
So on Shabbos, certain types of prohibitions are permitted under certain circumstances if you're to make a change.
Right.
And we had it earlier with respect to walking through the water.
Right.
And here's the key: it's permissible anyway to do that, because you're allowed to walk through water if it's not for pleasure; it's for the mitzvah. But we tell you to make a change, to remind you that you shouldn't really be doing this. You're doing it because you're having a permissibility. So it's not as if we can permit anything when you do it with a change.
Oh, yeah.
Right? That's a mistake people make. Like, oh, I'm hitting the light like this, I can turn it on with my elbow. It's only something that's permissible anyway. We enjoin you to do it with a change so that you can, but over here, it's a question of, it's not forbidden. The prohibition of wearing shoes only qualifies if it's a bona fide halachic shoe. And if it's not, it just the whole thing doesn't qualify. Change or no change, comfortable or not comfortable, it doesn't qualify unless it's a halachically bona fide shoe. That's what's going to emerge from tomorrow's discussion, and it's going to become much more crystallized when we learn the Shulchan Aruch itself, God willing. Okay, have a wonderful day, everybody.